Thank you, Marabella. It's my pleasure now to bring up Professor Chris Hodson. Chris Hodson is a professor of history. He focuses on the Atlantic world, Canada, North America, and other parts of the Atlantic world, and is also serving as the coordinator for Canadian studies at Brigham Young University and hosting the Palmer Annual Lecture Series in Canadian Studies. And he will introduce Professor Stevenson. Chris.
Welcome, everybody. This is the Palmer Lecture in Canadian Studies, which is an annual lecture we hold by the Kennedy Center in this case, on topics in many disciplines related to all things Canada. And we're delighted to bring the Palmer Lecture together with this semester's Kennedy Center Lecture Series. I've been trying to pitch this in my various communications with people in my best announcer voice as the crossover event of the semester. I hope that worked. And we're especially delighted to welcome Professor Allyson Stevenson to BYU. Professor Stevenson holds, count them up, a BA, an MA, and a PhD in history from the University of Saskatchewan, and is currently a faculty member in history at the University of Saskatchewan, where she holds the Gabriel Dumont Chair in Métis Studies. Professor Stevenson's research focuses on gender, childhood, political activism, and family life among Métis communities in Canada and the United States during the 19th and 20th centuries. She's published widely on policies and practices regarding child welfare and adoption, as well as the vital role of Métis women as political actors. She's perhaps best known for her book, Intimate Integration, the 60s Scoop and the Colonization of Indigenous Kinship, which was published by the University of Toronto in 2017, and it is a bracing history of transracial adoption projects in Canada during the 1960s and beyond. We're extremely pleased to welcome Professor Stevenson to BYU because her work not only fits the Palmer Lecture bill exceptionally well, but promises an important contribution to this semester's Kennedy Center theme, Legacies of Colonialism. So please welcome Professor Allyson Stevenson.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here today, to Chris and to Quinn and the Kennedy Center, and thank you for the prayer. So Tansei, Allyson Stevenson, Nitsi Gasson, Nichi, Ocho, Flet Springs. Hello, that was Cree. My name is Allyson Stevenson, and I'm from Flet Springs, Saskatchewan. So I want to also, in addition to thanking the students for being here, faculty members, and other members of the community, thank the community that I've been working with to present the talk I'm going to be giving today. Cumberland House, First Nations and Métis committee members of the Museum Committee who have provided a great deal of support for me along the way in preparing this research and this talk, as well as acknowledge the traditional territory of the Ute people that the university is on and the town of Provo is on as well. I'm a Métis historian in the Indigenous Studies Department, and my family is Métis from Kinistino, Glenmary, as well as Cumberland House, or Kamanistigo Manayagoskak, which is the Cree name for Cumberland House. The term Pine Island translated into Cree. As a Gabriel Dumont Research Chair in Métis Studies, my research that I'm speaking about today has been supported by the Gabriel Dumont Institute chair funding that I've received as part of the chair, as well as the University of Saskatchewan internal SSHRC partnership grant. So just acknowledging the support that I've had from the various funders as well. I've been working with the community of Cumberland House since 2021 and began meeting with them to discuss the development of a museum. And so these are some of my community partners that I've been working with from Cumberland House when we attended a really important and amazing installment of contemporary Métis beadwork called Radical Stitch. That was first housed in Regina and has been traveling across Canada and now into the US. And members of the committee there met with Sherry Farrasset, who has also really inspired me to understand Métis beadwork on a much deeper level. So the title of today's talk, Métis, Matriarchs, and Moccasins, the Social Relations of Métis Artistic Expression, seeks to capture the significance of Cree Métis women's laboring and loving as a decolonial practice against the dehumanizing colonial enterprise. The love and work of these women over generations can tell us about the social relations in Indigenous communities. They point us towards practices and modes of being that can enable individuals and communities to recenter Indigenous women's knowledge and authorities in spaces that are hostile, while creating communities of belonging. Generative and beautiful, these beadwork and embroidered items speak to us through time and space and enable us to contemplate the social relations in Cumberland House, Kamanistigo-Manaigosskak, that fostered the artistry of these women and the intergenerational knowledge transmission of Cree, Métis language and loving practice. So this is just an example of a pair of moccasins made by one of the women who's now passed in Cumberland House, passed down to her children. The pointed toe style and wraparound style of moccasins were used by men, worn by men. And I was told the pointed toe was helpful for when men would be able to slip on the snowshoes. They had to go put their snowshoes on and go out on the trail. So the pointed toe was useful and helpful for wearing snowshoes. This talk comes from my chapter in Métis Matriarchs, Agents of Transition, edited by Dr. Cheryl Troop and Dr. Doris Jean McKinnon, that recently came out this September. It focuses on the social relations between women in Cumberland House, highlighting key Métis matriarchs and their beadwork, including sisters Agnes Carrier and Margaret Macaulay, whose beadwork you just saw in the previous picture, as well as Isabel Impey. The values in the community and process of intergenerational knowledge transfer between women is an important nexus for examining the unique qualities of this community. The values and practices continue today and illustrate the strength of matriarchy as a key core Indigenous system that contributes to community resilience. The Cree language and its embedded values, Métis historical memory of resistance, and the Métis matriarchal familial context of Cumberland House have created a distinct historical and social milieu that is generative of profoundly important works of art and in individuals whose influence have shaped the present and continue to transform the future. In 2001, Dr. Sherry Phil-Rossett wrote that the future direction in Métis material cultural research was to resituate objects in their home communities, arguing, quote, perhaps the most important future need in future scholarship is to place the objects created by Métis women back within their human context and resist the current decontextualized and dehumanized treatment in museums, end quote. This is the matriarch room in the museum in Cumberland House. It's located at the end of the road in the northern village of Cumberland House. It holds exquisite treasures created by Cree Métis women artists from the late 19th and early 20th century. As you can see, it's a very small room, but it is very full of the kind of work and the artistry that the women of Cumberland House have created. And this is just from within the community's own collection that you see here, these objects. In addition to the community's inheritance, in 2019, several rare and finely crafted beadwork items were returned home to Cumberland House, rematriated. Referred to as the Cotter Collection for the family who had kept them, they are now on display back home in the community of Cumberland House. alongside the photos of communities, families, and other significant cultural items. When placed together, each item contributes to restoring the history of the people and place of Kaministigo-Menaygo-Skak and the northern trapping and fishing economy that sustained them. Grounded in the Cree Métis worldview, the recently reopened Community Museum was first established by Kwijich, Victoria Mackay, a local historian, archaeologist, curator, and author, as a space to tell the community stories of deep and ongoing historical presence, changes to the northern economy, and the significance of the people and place of Cumberland House. And so in these photos, the bottom left, I guess I can use my pointer. This is a photo from the news story when the community originally went to Kelowna, BC, British Columbia in Canada, to reconnect with the collection, which was held by the Cotter family, which had previously, the Cotter family was in Cumberland House as a part of the fur trade in the early 20th century, and had these items that they had brought home with them and passed down through their family. And so that's just a close-up of some of the beadwork that was in there. And here you can see in this photo, which was taken this summer for the 250th anniversary of Cumberland House, the items are now in a special section of the museum referred to as the Cotter collection, and part of the overall museum displays and exhibitions back within the community. And so that's just kind of the progression, I guess you would say, of that process of rematriation. So where is Cumberland House? The community of Cumberland House is situated in Treaty 5 territory and home in Saskatchewan, and home to Cree-speaking First Nations and Métis people who have inhabited the area since time immemorial. It is frequently credited as being the oldest settled community in the province of Saskatchewan, recently celebrating its 250th anniversary. The Cree name is Kaministigo-Menaygo-Skak, which is Cree for Pine Island. The community is situated on an island, as you can see in that sign there, in the Saskatchewan River Delta. Saskatchewan River Delta is the largest inland delta in North America. And of course, like many other waterways in North America, is extremely impacted by dams and other developments along the upstream. The village of Cumberland House is located on the shore of Cumberland Lake, surrounded by the waters of the Big Stone River, the Saskatchewan River, and the Tearing River. East of Cumberland House, the Saskatchewan River channels converge, flowing easterly to Lake Winnipeg, to the Hudson Bay, and eventually into the Arctic Ocean. This community was highly instrumental in the fur trade period between 1760 till the early 20th century. And many Métis people and First Nations continue to be fluent Cree speakers, speaking the N dialect, Swampy Cree. Indeed, they retain a strong connection to the lands and waters of the Delta through their ongoing intergenerational water-based practices of trapping, fishing, and paddling. In the rematriation of Kaministigo-Menaygo-Skak's history and material culture in the space of the museum, Indigenous women's centrality is reasserted powerfully as an act of remembrance, revitalization through Miki Sisti Kiwewen, beating through the generations. Finding teaching and inspiration embedded in the past labors of Indigenous women is the basis for much decolonial work being done in scholarship and communities. In areas that include contemporary beadwork, restoring gender balance in families and communities, the revitalization of Indigenous law, and Indigenous literatures, it is often women's teachings, methods, and labor which inform decolonial efforts. As Jeanette Armstrong proclaimed in 1996, quote, "We find our strength and our power in our ability to be what our grandmothers were to us, keepers of the next generation in every sense of the word, physically, intellectually, and spiritually, end quote. She continues to describe the essence that empowered grandmothers as a weapon which one wields for both protection and to nurture. This inheritance of fierce love from the grandmother, she argues, is Indigenous women's original strength. She states, "It is the strength of this female force that holds together all nations and families together in health. It is the bridge to the next generation. It is the female power that is the key to the survival of us all. In an environment that is becoming increasingly damaged and unfit for all life forms. It is women who hold this power and become powerful only when catalyzing cooperation and harmony, and therefore health at all levels, from the individual outward to the family, the community, and to the environment," end quote. Colonialism attempts to destroy love and connection through the dismantling of the relational nature of Indigenous lifeways. The imposition of colonial laws, removals, racial theories of Indigenous inferiority, residential schooling, and the 60s scoop have attempted to remove Indigenous women from positions of authority in families and communities. The absence created through loss of historical knowledge and the loss of women's artwork and its ability to speak to communities across generations is a felt injustice that fuels efforts to bring these items home. Empowered matriarchal love animates and activates efforts to return to loving communities through transmitting the values and principles encoded in language and day-to-day sustaining activities. Lindsay Nixon argues that a return to Indigenous love brings about Indigenous feminist change in colonial institutions. She argues that ethical love is a pedagogy of relationality taught to Indigenous people by kin, siblings, aunties, grandparents, and other individuals of influence, and activated its animated self through attentiveness to kinship responsibilities. In the work of contemporary curators, artists, Indigenous Relational Aesthetics, IRA, acts to disrupt colonial project which devalues Indigenous women's material cultural production, such as beadwork and embroidery. Further, she argues that Indigenous relational aesthetics make space for materialist feminist considerations within curatorial and creative practice, resisting the sole focus of human-to-human relationalities within an extended kinship network and a limited understanding of material relations as enacted primarily between bodies and bodies. Materialities like the beadwork, quillwork, moccasins, etc., be loved, and instill love, and relate to the communities from which they derive. The clothing and adornments that sought to beautify, warm, comfort, and impress continue to impact communities. As Sherry Farrell-Rissette has found, European men sought Métis women's artistic production as desirable symbols of the Western frontier, both practical and beautiful. Sewing and beading into the 20th century provided economic opportunities for skilled women to support families. As well, they continued to bead for their own families. As these pieces are brought home by communities and individuals to be restored, the active force of love that generated the creation of them returns once more as a way to empower Indigenous relationalities. The significance of Métis women's artistic production as both a historical source and a work of art has until recently gone unrecognized. Past Victorian notions that devalued, quote, women's work and museum categorizations that misattributed Métis works to those of other nations and collections, and categorizations of craft, quote, rather than art by museums and collectors continue to have economic impacts in Indigenous communities, as well as contributing to a misrepresentation in Métis art. The value and importance of women's artistry is becoming more widely recognized, however. As Indigenous interdisciplinarian and artist, Sherifa Rissette's reconnection with pieces found in museums and private collections, along with historical analysis and community-based understandings, have illuminated research methods for Indigenous cultural material items. These beloved articles from the past play a critical role for the future. As Rissette states, quote, "We search collections not to replicate the past, but rather to learn from it and reclaim it in the present." So these are some photos from the museum collection in Cumberland House, highlighting the importance of women's work from their original pieces before they used to assemble their artistic creations to the end product of what they've created with their artistry. Métis women's material cultural production offers a rare window to the past. Many of us know that Indigenous women, like all women, are generally absent from historical documents and sources. And, quote, "Women have left few written records of their lives." Often early observers or anthropologists who were recording events taking place in communities ignored women's work and diminished their activities. As being men, were primarily interested in the doings of other men. However, if we remember, women created most material in museum collections, even if much of it was used by men. Farah Rissette states, "We can see it as a remarkable intellectual, technical, and artistic legacy." Beadwork, embroidery, rug hooking, and quill work provide a rich historical source, especially so when community oral history and Indigenous language is still spoken, or when the practice is still carried out and undertaken in the community. As individuals and collectively, Métis women's active engagements, securing resources for families, enacting relational ethics, fierce love, and collective laboring and political activism speak to non-hierarchical Métis social relations and are embodied through actions that seek the well-being of the community. In Cumberland House, the distinctive historical and geographical context has enabled many to continue to practice Cree-Métis relational ethics well into the 20th century. Why in Cumberland House, unlike other locations in Saskatchewan? In Cumberland House, the colonial influences of church and government indeed impacted gender relations. However, the forces of Métis land dispossession operated differently than in locations in the Southern Plains regions. The Métis community and Cree community remained a collective with a measure of control over its schools and the ability to engage, although in a highly regulated way, in the fishing and trapping economy into the 20th century. Evictions and removals experienced by Métis in the southern agricultural regions and Indian Act provisions reducing mobility and removing children from family homes do not constitute the experience of this community to the same extent as other Métis communities. However, environmental degradation due to damming and its impact on the economic livelihood of fishers and trappers, and land losses and broken treaty promises do feature prominently in this community. However, the lands and waters of the Delta, the Cree language, and Métis histories of resistance and the matriarchal social system sustained artistic practices and enabled the intergenerational transfer of Indigenous knowledges now being rematriated in Cumberland House. The turn of the century, Métis women's embodied experiences as artisans, seamstresses, and mothers were captured by Cumberland House's Cree Métis historians, Virginia Mackay, Jean Carrier, Pierre Dorian, and Marie Deschambault, in a history book that they prepared in the 1970s. History book, it's actually a pamphlet that they wrote, and it's in the archives at the U of S. But it is a history book. In it, they demonstrate the value of Indigenous lifeways and saw the importance of preserving the stories of their community for the future. In their writing, we can see the values of hard work, bush skills, self-sufficiency, generosity, and strength that they captured. The Cumberland House historians describe the incredible beadwork and embroidery work that women did in an understated manner. Quote, this is from their history. Moccasins were made by the women with bead and silk thread, used to make designs, and also porcupine quills added a lovely design. The hair of a horsetail was also used, end quote. In addition to moccasins, the women made winter wear. Quote, this is from their history here. Parkas were also made lovely with moose hide, satin, beads, silk threads, and ribbons sewn on the hood. Gloves and mittens added to the lovely outfits, which were made too with moose hide. End quote. Not only did the women cut and sew and bead and embroider the clothing and moccasins they made for loved ones, they prepared and tanned the moose hide used for their clothing. These pieces honored the people who wore them and communicated to the human and non-human world through the intricate designs that animated the hides. And so just a little bit about this piece here. That was recently added to the community collection. That's a complete men's outfit that was beaded by several sisters and put together by sisters and women members of the community. It was worn in the 1960s and 70s for the men that would go out to winter festivals, trapping festivals, dog sleds, and men in the community were noted for being championship sledders, dog sledders, paddlers, and goose callers, and still are recognized for those abilities. So I just wanted to highlight that these outfits continued to be worn by men into the 20th century and 21st century, and reflect the pride that people had in the women's artistry, but also the pride that the men had as they wore these into these various public events that they were participating and winning in. So women did their beading and trained the next generation of matriarchs at the kitchen tables in Cumberland House. According to knowledge holder and artist Isabel Impey, reflecting on her influences becoming a master beader, she says, quote, I think that the highlight of when I think back is when we had this big circle of people in the kitchen, and they'd put on all the lights, and they would throw a cloth on the table, and we had benches, and the women would gather and learn to bead. The older women would demonstrate the craft to the younger generations around the table. And she recalled, quote, women were showing us, this is how you bead, this is how you make this. It was a moose hide jacket. So that's a moose hide jacket there in that photo. This is where I started, and as soon as I could handle the needles, I was allowed to participate, and it was such a nice warm place to be, and you'd have this, maybe lard pail burns, or something with a lamp sitting on top, so the light would spread throughout the table, so everyone could see their needles and beads. We would be making these jackets or different garments for the men in the family, or else we made moccasins for ourselves. So by the candlelight, there was clearly no electricity at the time. Women got together and beaded items like we see here. Isabel's artistic creations are currently held in the Gabriel Dumont Institute's collection, as are many of her teachings that she passed on this knowledge and how she learned, and her teachings on beadwork in the collection, a digital collection, and also a material collection. So in the 1950s and 60s in Cumberland House, women continued crafting winter garments, moccasins, and gloves, and in doing so, passed down this knowledge to youth in the community. Isabel and Pay remember that, quote, some of the things we made were garments for people to wear, particularly things that you would want people to be warm in the winter. It is very cold in Saskatchewan. It's nothing to sneeze at, that's for sure. You definitely want to be warm, especially if you're traveling long distances on the trail. Scraps of leftover materials were stitched together to recreate warm and beautiful blankets. In the community, such creations were undertaken by many women. The love and friendly competition with joyful anticipation of new life animated women's creations and wrapped family and community in the priceless gift of belonging. Because of the prevalence of women artisans in the community over generations, Cumberland House beadwork shares a traditional floral design, but there's also been innovation in style and patterns. So you can see there's floral beadwork in that, in this particular example, but also a goose in that it's a fur hat. There's a beaded goose on the hat as well. And in some of the others, there's beaded ducks or beaded eagles and things like that. So it's just more than the floral design that women use. And so Leah Dorian, Métis scholar and artist as well, undertook a project working with elders, collecting oral histories about child rearing and values and practices in Cumberland House, and provides insight into the nature of a mothered community. Dorian found that men's leadership in public forums and through the administration of law may give the appearance of a patriarchal system, participation in public events with highly stylized attire. However, foundationally, she found women were the holders of the law and decision makers. Quote, from her research, James Burns expresses the grandmothers are the keepers of all the medicines, laws, and stories, end quote. This reflected in the question people ask each other, even today, who are your grandmothers? To understand kinship connections and relationships. Beyond the individual tasks of physical labor for family, shared labor in beading, or child rearing, women had responsibilities in the area of governance. Environmental and cultural knowledge were instrumental. The late Anne Acco Carrier, the daughter of Agnes and Pierre Carrier, who would have been a sister to the man who wore this outfit, situates the health and vitality of the community and the ability of the land to provide for the physical, spiritual, social, cultural, and economic needs of the Métis people of Cumberland House. It is in the context of a healthy environment and balanced gender roles that the community remains Métis. Women kept family history, which included birth dates and ancestral stories. And she recalled that, quote, my Aunt Margaret Macaulay, one of the artists that we saw here, told me that at the turn of the century, not only was genealogy recited, but also the availability of female family members was currency in marriage brokerage run by medicine people. Double cousins were tracked to keep any cousins as far apart as possible, end quote. She likewise remarked on the importance of matrilineal connection to grandmothers. Details about family history were kept in the oral history among female family members. And women continued to ask who your grandmothers were and shared historical notes. The rematriation of Cumberland House, taking place in Cumberland House, and return of the items from the Cotter collection in 2019 continues to enable the local community to restore their relationships to the past and to experience a multi-sensory engagement with artwork created by ancestors. In the distinctive curatorial practice of the local committee, the Quijich Historical Society, Miki Sastikiwan, doing beadwork to connect generations, becomes a metaphor for the loving act of remembering that centers men's and women's laboring. In the community, these objects are no longer isolated and decontextualized, but rather placed in conversation with other pieces gathered together to tell the story of Métis matriarchs in the 20th and 21st century. The artistic production and influence of the Métis artisans of Cumberland House and the cultural and material inheritance left by early Cumberland House matriarchs reveals Cree Métis matriarchal social relations expressed through women's artistic production, connecting these pieces with their stories and resituating them within the context of gendered, intergenerational transmission of knowledge demonstrates how matriarchal social relations continue to influence contemporary Indigenous artists, scholars, and community members who recenter these values in their work today and imagine a decolonial future while resisting patriarchy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a wonderfully insightful lecture. We will have about 15 or 20 minutes for discussion. We invite you to participate in that discussion. And if you do have a class that starts at 1 and you need to leave a little before we end at 1 o'clock, you're welcome to do so. If you have a question, we invite you to raise your hand. We have Alex and Kimball on two sides of the room with microphones. They'll bring a microphone to you. We invite you to stand and tell us your name if you're a student or a faculty member. Tell us what department you're coming from. And we will go until 1 p.m. Thank you.
My name is Cyrus Lee. I'm in the anthropology department, a student here. And the question that I had was, you talked about kind of the writing down of oral histories and the recording of that, as well as the knowledge of how to do beadwork. And within the museum context, that obviously shows this is how, some of this happens in the process. But I wanted to know the other kind of experiences that are happening. You talked about the experience of sitting with grandmothers and the young women in a home, I suspect. Are those kind of activities happening as well as kind of the museum curation? What other activities are used to pass the knowledge? Because I feel like it's important that it is grandmothers and young women sitting with each other. It's not just about showing off or reading the histories. And that's kind of what I wanted to know, if that's okay.
That's a really great question. Thank you for asking that, Silas. Based on my understanding, sitting in the community and visiting, there is not as much of that taking place. Like that really important social context, which is kind of the goal of this paper, was to demonstrate that it's not just the beadwork, it is reflective of the actual practices. So that is, people, as these items are coming back home, it's hopeful that the practices will return along with them. People have used them to kind of self-train, to kind of understand the process and teach themselves, but there has been a period where that transmission has not taken place. But unlike many other communities, Indigenous, Métis, First Nations, it hasn't been 5 generations. It's only within like 1 generation. And you see there are, beading workshops that take place at universities or cultural centers or online, but it's not within that kind of like home, like kitchen table context where likely the genealogies would be passed down, the language was shared. So there is a bit of the gap in that, the context and social relations that you, I think, astutely allude to as being fundamental to this process. So, you're welcome. Yes.
My name's Natalie. I'm studying human development with a minor in global women's studies. And I was just wondering, with the beading and like all of the clothing and blankets they were making, was that just like for personal use, like making it for your family, or was it also like, was it being sold and traded in like a tool for economic success too?
Great question. I think it would vary from individual to individual, to family. There is an elder that is 98 years old that lives in a care home that still beads and sews and sells her items for, to make money. So that is an important part of it as well. And I've heard less about that, but certainly that same elder, her mother talked about selling to the RCMP. The RCMP, like that's the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. It's the National Police Force in Canada. That were stationed in Cumberland House would ask for beadwork, and so they would commission pieces. So there was some sales of beadwork items by visitors to the community as well. So yes.
So my name's Lauren Moon. I'm studying neuroscience with a minor in global women's studies. And this has been fascinating. First, I want to congratulate you. I feel like this lecture was very focused on women. And I feel like sometimes even though we're talking about some of these things, we get a little distracted. I love that it was focused on them and the intrinsic value of this work. But I had a couple of questions too about when you were talking about how grandmothers were like the keeper of law and medicine and stories. And about how they knew to keep like second cousins apart from marrying and things like that science part I'm really fascinated in. So what does that mean exactly, that they were the keepers of the law and of medicine, things like that?
That is a very deep question. It grandmothers, elderly women, I guess you would say, because it's both. It can be biological grandparents as well as sort of, adoptive, or that taking on that role of the elder in the community. It was very frequently, from everything that I've read and heard, women had the knowledge, plant science knowledge, that they provided to community members for their health and well-being on the basis of like emergency basis as well as a sort of like overall health basis. Their knowledge of, I guess, family and kinship connections would enable them to prevent family members marrying in too close. So while, certainly it's Indigenous story and the roles of traditional knowledge for a period of time were, sort of dismissed, I think many are revisiting that knowledge and those stories to gain a better understanding of this scientific and environmental and health and wellness based teachings that were held within that. So yeah.
Sorry, I had to turn the mic on.
Oh.
My name's Harrison, and I'm a history major. I actually just returned from a mission in the Canada-Winnipeg mission, so I was around in places like North Battleford, Regina, Weyburn, but there was like a particularly large Métis population in Kenora, Ontario, where I served, and so that just makes me wonder how similar is the matriarchal nature of Cumberland House and that part of Métis society, how similar is that throughout the prairies and those other Métis populations?
Mm-hmm. My understanding is that Cumberland House is distinct in that that sort of context continued well into the 20th, and it still exists in the community today for reasons that, are related to a lot of the families are very self-determining and didn't face the kind of settlement pressures or were refugees from settlement pressures. There's a lot of families that came from displacements of other communities, Métis communities. So it's hard for me to say, the extent to which the matriarchal social relations are similar in other Métis communities. I know that we have a lot of strong women in our communities, and it seems to be a common thread that I can't speak for Ontario. I don't know so much about that, but it's it's a common thread in many Métis communities that women are carry a lot of different roles.
My name is Clayton Smith. I'm studying French. You said a little bit during your lecture about how the embroidery has the capacity to love and to be loved. So I was just wondering if you could go into a little bit more about the mindset of how the Métis think about that.
Yeah, that is the teaching, that it has the capacity, it has the capacity to love the community. And what that is related to, I'm just a very early learner in Cree language. The term Métis, which is the kind of root word of, means bead, but it's related to shell, the original shell term, because Indigenous people use shells before, or turned shells into beads and various other items into beads. Has a spiritual component as well. So there's, and the hides of the animals that are used as the foundation for the beadwork were taken from animals in a ceremonial way. So there's a lot of teaching that I don't fully understand, but allude to it being a sort of canvas, an active canvas that speaks to the, like, that is alive itself and speaks to nature and the animals when the men are out, as well as the people in the community. So, yeah.
Hi, my name's Marin. I'm studying art history. I really thought it was interesting, this idea of the Cumberland House taking objects out of museums, out of colonized environments, and putting it back into its more humanized perspective. Do you feel like this method is working more or less to help decolonize? And do you think this could be maybe a model for other groups and other peoples who are trying to decolonize themselves?
Well, that's a really great question. So when I first began meeting with Cumberland House, they had a museum in their community in the 1990s, the structure that they're using now. It had since closed and was being used as a Kids First facility. And over time, working the repatriation, which happened prior to me working with the community, over time, they found a new location for Kids First and reestablished the museum in the community in about shortly after our trip to the Radical Stitch exhibit. It was completely refurbished, repainted inside and out. The item, like the Cotter collection, was moved from the school into the museum, and bit by bit, piece by piece, it became a museum. And with this summer, the 2024 commemoration, it was really powerful to see the people like coming back to the community. Like, these are like kind of like super tough guys that are really out there and get really emotional about the beadwork. Because they talked about their grandmothers beading for them and making them outfits, and they talked about, some of the women talked about watching their moms bead for them, and the anticipation that they felt as like each little piece came together and then they finally got to wear it that first day, crunching through the snow in their brand new moccasins. So I think it's been, as a person that I didn't grow up in that community, I definitely love everybody there and feel a connection to them. But it's been really powerful to watch how, this particular process of the museum and the beadwork has, been revitalizing a lot of different areas in Cumberland. So, yeah.
Hi, my name is Ashley Drennan. I'm a psych major and I have a global women's studies minor. I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about like the challenges that the Métis people have faced, like whether that's like specifically with setting up the museum or getting the pieces that they've been recollecting, or even just like the trickle-down effect of colonialism that's made it harder to like decolonize.
Okay. The easiest answer is talking about how the pieces came back. The harder, more complex discussion is the ongoing impacts of colonialism. But that's the point of this, legacies of colonialism, so it's probably important to address that as well. So I guess one of the specific complexities in Cumberland House related to the Métis repatriation and decolonization is around the creation in Canada of categories of difference between First Nations or legal Indians and Métis people who were excluded from the Indian Act. So those kinds of categories have shifted over time substantially, and where people are Indigenous, categories of Métis and Indian serve to continue to create barriers, political, ideological, and legal barriers on the tiny island of Cumberland House that has a First Nation and a village. So those are not specific to the museum collection, but they are certainly inform a lot of the work that can or can't be done because of something called jurisdiction. There's various levels of legal, municipal, national, provincial, and First Nations and Métis governance that are intertwined in ways that would take 10 years of lecture time to kind of unravel and sort of peel apart. But it impacts the folks in Cumberland because of the historic divisions that they have to navigate on a daily basis. So.
Hi, my name is Dallin. I'm studying public health. My question, in your view, how would you see the role of reconciliation in federal and provincial governments better supporting Indigenous matriarchal structures and roles?
Yeah, that's a really great question. In our earlier I was a guest in an earlier class, girlhood and children, and in Canada we also had a missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry, 2017. So we had a process called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was meant to, at a national level, kind of understand. It came out of a class action lawsuit as a sort of facet of that settlement, to kind of understand, evaluate, and provide guidelines for reconciliation in Canada, reflecting on the role of residential schools and the impacts that's had on First Nations and Canadian relations. Shortly thereafter, there was less known inquiry into the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And so they offered also recommendations, calls to justice. And so there are not a lot of people focusing on the calls to justice in the same way they are the calls to action with the TRC and Truth and Reconciliation. So it is a public health crisis, what Indigenous women and girls experience. There are very entrenched interests in maintaining, sort of the inequalities that Indigenous people, specifically women and girls, face in Canada. So it's not impossible. I think this is one, connecting beadwork and artistry to relations can kind of help people understand on a different level about what the role of women and girls, because it's difficult to communicate that with people outside of an Indigenous context, if that makes sense. So I don't necessarily have an answer, but I'm sort of, listening and trying to understand what the best way forward is too.